Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. The United Nations cooperates with regional and international partners in efforts to diffuse various tensions, encourage improvements on the ground, and advance political negotiations toward resolutions to the various conflicts in the Middle East. That said, the inability of the United Nations to pass effective resolutions with regard to the raging war in Syria, a clear bias against the state of Israel and the decades-old conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, and the questionable use of international funds in rehabilitating war-stricken areas raises the question as to the effectiveness of the world body. To further discuss this topic, I'm joined here in the studio by Dr. Hili Modrik Even-Chen, who is a lecturer at Sharei Mishpat, which is the Academic Center of Law and Science. Welcome. And I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Dr. Nir Boms, who is a research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. Welcome. Mr. Oren, give us a broader understanding of how relevant is the United Nations these days at the various conflicts raging in the Middle East?
Well, it is obviously much less relevant than it was some 70 years ago when the United Nations General Assembly partition resolution, Resolution 181, established the basis for the creation of the State of Israel and another Arab or Palestinian state which did not come into being, plus a separate body for Jerusalem. And then there were mediation efforts, some of them successful, by Ralph Bunche and others, and the UN emergency force following the 1956 Suez campaign. But recently, because the United Nations cannot be more effective than the sum of the great powers running the Security Council, plus some blocks of nations in the General Assembly, it has not been very effective. In addition to the UN bodies that we mentioned, the Security Council and the General Assembly, of course, there are UN agencies such as UNRWA taking care of refugees, and peacekeeping or observer forces such as UNDOF on the Golan Heights and UNIFIL in Lebanon. Right now, even though the United Nations is part of the so-called quartet, along with the United States, Russia, and the European Union, it's in a sort of hiatus. It does not bring much force into the Middle East peace negotiations.
Dr. Modrik Even-Chen, when we're talking about the United Nations in bringing forth the various resolutions pertaining to the Middle East, we see in the various entangled conflicts that are raging currently in the Middle East a lot of challenges. When we're talking also on the legal aspect of things, of course, the interests of the UN Security Council, world powers, whether it's the P5, when we're talking about Syria or Israel, whatever they don't want to pass doesn't pass. So what's the point?
Yes, this is a very crucial question, whether the UN can continue being an important and relevant body in this area and in the world in general, because you could see that there are many places that have armed conflicts, and there is no ability to solve them because of the veto of the superpowers, of the P5, as you call them. And this is what we see in Syria. This is what we see, the inability of any state to do anything in accordance with the UN approval. It is only an independent initiative of states that could go on and solve or at least try to solve those conflicts.
Dr. Boms, when we're talking specifically about the Syria conflict, we have various resolutions that the UN Security Council tried to pass with regarding to this conflict, all of which were vetoed in one way or another by the Russian Federation. Nothing is really practical when it comes to the ability to truly pass a resolution that would effectively change the reality on the ground without one of the powers demanding amendments to this resolution. How can such a world body that was actually put together in order to try and bring some order to a chaos raging bring about a change when it doesn't align with the interests of all the various partners?
Well, I think in very simple terms, It might not. I remember spending some time not so long ago in the Golan Heights explaining to a group about the work of the United Nations observers, UNDOF, and somebody was asking me, how can that be? I mean, look at what's happening on the other side. Can they do something? Can they intervene? What do you mean they cannot do anything? I said, of course they can do something. They can write their urgent report. And that urgent report will go into the chain of command, and somebody will perhaps even put an urgent motion on the table. And this urgent motion on the table will eventually go through the other motions, and eventually somebody may even do something with it, and we'll have a certain paper in the United Nations that calling for a cessation of violence. We've seen that happening in the Middle East, but we need to remember that the United Nations is no more and no less than the sum of its parts. And in some way, it's also connected to the weakest link on the chain. Either you have a stronger superpower that is able to veto, or you have other blocks that are able to basically say, well, if it's not, I'm not there, and therefore we're going to make sure the resolution is not going to pass. And therefore, the United Nations is mainly an emissary of the current world order. It's not its own entity, and we cannot assume that the United Nations all of a sudden would be able to solve the conflicts that its own members actually created.
Mr. Owen?
The United Nations is a noble endeavor. And of course, the effort was not to repeat the mistakes of the League of Nations following World War I. But almost immediately after it was established in 1945, one saw the divisions between the Soviet Union and the United States, which started in the Korean War when the Soviets abstained and the UN acted unilaterally in a way. So what we have instead of the United Nations are coalitions of the willing, to use the term that Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld put into usage. You have many nations under some leadership acting outside the boundaries of the United Nations. If they are successful, it can be legitimized by some resolution in the United Nations. But the United Nations per se cannot do a lot. There are some agencies, some other bodies, such as the IAEA, the Atomic Energy Agency, or you have the International Criminal Court. These are all international bodies behind which one can see the contour of the great powers. But if the great powers cannot agree between themselves, you are not going to have any movement.
Nevertheless, when we're looking on the regional aspects of things, we do hear about a lot of situations where the UN was a viable contender in diffusing certain tensions, whether it's between Israel and Lebanon. We hear a lot of situations that have viably conflagrated, but at the last moment, the United Nations managed to reach both sides and try to calm the situation. Is it truly the United Nations, or are those the key players and components of the United Nations which bring about this change?
Well, I will answer this, but I also wanted to say something about what my colleague said before. I'm not sure that the UN actually reflects the current world order, because if you see, the framework that the UN has been brought upon was the one that was after the end of Second World War. And this is why Germany, of course, cannot be part of the P5. And you see that Japan is not there, even though it actually finances more than a third of the UN budget. And so it is a very not flexible organization. And this is one of its problems. And now to your question, I think that what the UN actually should do in order to be relevant in the area is to get adjusted to the changes. And Mr. Oren also mentioned the ICC. Well, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is also dependent on the UN Security Council, because there are situations in which you can only start an investigation if the UN Security Council approves it. So even the ICC is not an independent body. And what is important for the UN to do is to cooperate with non-state actors that we see that become the main organizations, and they're even sometimes more important than states. And if the UN could find a way to cooperate with non-state actors, And even though they cannot be members or official members of the UN, then maybe its efforts would be more efficient in solving problems in the area.
Is this the same like the situation currently in Syria, where we're seeing de Mistura, Staffan de Mistura, the UN envoy to Syria, trying to move forward a political process through the various channels of the United Nations in Geneva, but at the same time, the more effective summit in this picture currently is in Astana, brokered by Russia, Iran, and Turkey, which has actually brought about a certain basis for the United Nations efforts in Geneva?
Well, and this with some hope that the Astana process will actually indeed result in some resolution that's going to indeed be effective. But part of it, the Staffan de Mistura leadership or anyone else from the United Nations, has to do with the informal leadership within the corridors of power. After all, if we're looking at Russia putting together the Astana process and then inviting the United States and other powers and even the United Nations in, and then this is again a member state of the United Nations getting part of the channel established by the United Nations by another entity that it did not represent well the Russians' interests, and therefore they thought that they need to create another structure of power. We speak about a changing structure of power. Dr. Mudrik said that the UN is anachronistic in a sense that it reflects a structure of power that existed 70 years ago. Now we have state powers, we have non-state powers, we have other coalitions that actually hold more effective power. And they are the ones who needs to deal with these anachronistic mechanisms. And when these mechanisms do not work, they simply go around them.
Mr. Owen, when we're looking at the United Nations, as you also mentioned earlier with regard to the quartet, the UN was part of a group of nations that was taking part, even though Russia, the EU, and the United States are part of the United Nations. They were acting as separate entities within this quartet in order to bring about a viable solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But isn't that a sign that the world powers don't actually believe the United Nations is a viable body to execute important decisions?
There is a paradox there, because the world powers, big and small, would like their citizens to have the illusion of a United Nations as a separate body, run by international civil servants, led by a Secretary General. And ostensibly, if you have covert diplomacy and only a small overt part of it, you would like the third party, the United Nations, to table the compromise, which was really hatched behind the scenes, because it would be more palatable to domestic audiences. But when you have an energetic Secretary General like Dag Hammarskjöld, or later Uthant, who in a way caused the Six-Day War of 1967 by too readily acceding to the demands of the Egyptian president Nasser and withdrawing the UN force. By the way, today it is not possible because the Security Council took away these powers and turned it back into itself. Then the governments are not happy with the independence of the Secretary General. So you have such incidents, such as the quartet with the UN part of it, but it really all goes back to what happens in the governments. Nevertheless, you have some success stories, such as Resolution 242, which for the last almost 50 years has remained the only formula with any chance of solving the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Dr. Modric Eventgen, how do you view this predicament of the United Nations, on the one hand demanding the mandate, on the other hand not really receiving it by the UN Security Council or by the member states?
I think if we think about the last decision of the UN Security Council that was actually effective, we can think about the first Gulf War, where the UN Security Council authorized the coalition to begin this war. And afterwards, in 2003, then the UN acted on itself. And in former Yugoslavia, it was NATO taking its own initiative. So I'm not sure that in this current situation where there is always a conflict between Russia that wishes to have more and more influence in the Middle East, and between Russia and the U.S. That anything effective and meaningful can actually become realized in this.
Nevertheless,
area.
we look at various resolutions. The last resolution, which was passed before U.S. President Barack Obama has left office, Resolution 2334. On the one hand, it signified a big change on the part of the United States, where it actually abstained rather than vetoed the resolution. But on the other hand, a few months have passed since then, and nothing has happened. So, what is the significance of such a resolution?
Yes, that was I was trying to say before. I think that anything that has actual implications, I don't believe that the UN could initiate it. It is only the superpowers themselves.
Dr. Boms, but nevertheless, we do have resolutions such as 1701, which ended the Second Lebanon War between Israel and the Hezbollah organization, the Iranian proxy in Lebanon. Do we believe that such a resolution can actually effectively bring about a cessation of hostilities as it has actually done? Or is this just a reason for both sides to say, here it works and just let us be?
When you have a resolution moderated either by United Nations, another power, or by the parties themselves, it's because the two parties realize that there is a time for a resolution, and that probably reflects the interests of both parties at the given time. The issue afterwards, what do you do after these resolutions seems to expire? So if we speak about Syria, UNDOF, the observation forces that observe the cessation of hostilities or the ceasefire between Israel and Syria, it has a mandate. It has a very clear mandate. It needs to make sure that there is a demilitarized zone, and then forces either from the Israeli side or from the Syrian side would not come in. Well, we know that in Syria, that problem is long gone. We have other forces, Islamists, we have the Islamic States, we have Hezbollah, but none of these forces were mandated. And therefore, the observers, when you ask them, says, well, yes, we take some notes, but this is not our mandate to deal with it. If you want to change the mandate, not a problem. Let's go back to the General Assembly, then perhaps go to the Security Council, and let's do something that one cannot do because the other powers would not object with, and therefore you will keep the situation as is. And that's why sometimes these big structures that are very cumbersome and complicated and bureaucratic and not able to change so quickly are becoming, in many ways, obsolete.
Mr.
You
Oren,
pointed in the right direction in your question, because the context is the pretext. When both sides have an exit strategy, but would not admit it to their domestic audiences, they need some deus ex machina, which would be the UN, coming out with a resolution. Then they will have to obey because it's world opinion, and then it all subsides and they can go back home. Also, there are local success stories. Nir mentioned UNDOF. There is also UNIFIL. UNIFIL is in charge of enforcing 1701 in Lebanon. It does a mediocre job, but without it, it would have been much worse. And the local commanders managed to speak through the UNIFIL command and leadership with other rogue elements. Israel, for instance, has no direct relationship with Hezbollah, but through UNIFIL, it can have an indirect dialogue.
Dr. Modric Eved-Chen, when we're looking at the various mandates, as Dr. Boms has stated, there is a significant challenge. Of course, in Syria, if we take it as an example, we see different forces on the ground. Also, at the time, there was an entire platoon of the United Nations, of the UNDOF force, that was captured by Jabhat al-Nusra, the Al-Qaeda-linked group there at the time. And they were brought back. There were various challenges attached to it, but then the United Nations withdrew. Now Israel states again that it wants to bring them back and even protect them in order to enforce some kind of barrier between Israel and chaos in Syria. Do you believe that the United Nations truly has the legitimacy, once this mandate expires, to continue and enforce a certain mandate that is not really relevant today?
But why do you think it is not?
when we're talking about the various changes on the ground, we're talking, as Dr. Boms has said, different forces that are not mentioned within the UN resolutions that was implemented in order to maintain the various ceasefires at hand. Do you believe that this situation on the ground, the reality that has changed drastically since when this resolution was brought about, is there some kind of mandate to continue to enforce such a mandate that is not relevant?
Well, of course, you have to take into consideration all the relevant circumstances when you try to renew a mandate. And I think we saw it in other areas in the world. For example, in Sarajevo, for example, Kosovo. I'm sorry, where UNBIC actually succeeded in managing the area, even though it does aspire for independence. And so, of course, you have to take into consideration the relevant circumstances that have changed.
Dr. Boms?
Again, the United Nations is mandated by its members, and it needs to serve the interests of its members. If the members cannot advance their interests through the mechanism of the United Nations, they will try to do it elsewhere. And I think Mr. Oren had aptly said that sometimes the United Nations is very useful for the powers to be to serve as a platform for them to reach a resolution or a certain agreement. The legitimacy of the United Nations, again, has to do with two things. On the ground, we actually have people who have relations, who are individuals, and who can try to make the best out of their mandated position. And they are there, and sometimes are able to actually prevent problems and sort issues, and they serve some usefulness. Other parts of them, they just hang out in a base somewhere with a pair of binoculars and write reports, and that perhaps waste of public funds, whatever this public may be. The relevancy of this operation will, I think, remains and continues to remain within the hands of the member states. And I think, again, because the power of the nature of power changes and the structure of power changes, the relevancy seems to dwindle a little bit with it.
Ever since the creation of the United Nations in October of 1945, there has been an idea which was never implemented to also establish a UN police force, a standing UN force. And of course, it has never been done because what's going to be the chain of command? There are various forces, but you have national contingents in them. It used to be that the Canadians and the Scandinavians were supposed to be so neutral as to serve in many conflicts. The problem for countries such as Israel is that national contingents from various countries become hostile to it when they serve around an area where they are influenced by the other side. So at first, Israel rejected contingents from countries with whom it didn't have diplomatic relations. Now it does have diplomatic relations with various countries, but then again, it finds that many of the troopers who go there go back to their countries anti-Israel.
Dr. Modric Evan-Chen, when we're talking about the United Nations, do you believe that there is, with all the criticism that is leveled at it, is there an alternative?
Well, this is the $1 million question, of course, and I'm not sure that we have to remain in this conservative thinking that the UN has to remain. Perhaps it will be. Perhaps there will be another body. Perhaps the structure will change. But of course, until this happens, we must also remember that the UN up to now has been the most effective organization in trying to keep the world order and to manage the use of force. And the UN Charter, which established the right to self-defense and mandated the use of force, but then also recognized that it must not be a definite principle, and that you could have the right to self-defense, and also the UN Security Council can also allow states to use force in order to protect themselves or other interests. Also, I wanted to say something about the UN
Very
forces.
shortly.
That, yes, we must remember, of course, that peacekeepers cannot actually be involved in hostilities, and also there is the problem that some of them have been accused in committing war crimes.
Well, as you said earlier about Yugoslavia or the former Yugoslavia, some governments have indeed fallen because of their inability to be active. But Dr. Boms, when we're talking about the United Nations as a whole, is it truly united in the sense of the ability of the countries to cooperate in bringing about viable solutions, or is it an organization that is so focused on the majority or the democratic platform within this organization that eventually it is a place for rhetoric of various leaders that are seeking their own national interests?
Well, shortly after the establishment of the United Nations, in a famous book, Hans Morgenthau wrote about the politics of nations and how a whole politics works. And he wrote about the politics of interest and the politics of power. What we have in the United Nations is the same. We have blocks. We have a Muslim bloc. We have a semi-democratic bloc, and this is, by the way, one of the alternatives that is sometimes being discussed in the context of creating a body that brings together the more democratic nations and is able to push toward perhaps what many see as the original values of the United Nations, values of people like Eleanor Roosevelt or Aneka Sen, who have been very much involved, for example, in the establishment of United Nations Human Rights Council. Because these interests and because these powers and blocks, that's what unites them. United Nations as a whole is, again, binded certainly not by unity and certainly not by values. You speak about countries that are at odds with each other, that are at war with each other, and sometimes the United Nations is the only platform where they can actually be together. So I think unity in that sense, again, in a very tacit and abstract way, the United Nations is not supposed to keep unity. Perhaps it's supposed to keep a little more discombobulating or a little less fragmentation for a very fragile world order.
Mr. Owen, we're actually coming to the end of the program, so I'd like each and every one of you to give your anticipation for the near future. How do you see the UN getting more involved and whether it would be more successful in the near future, Mr. Owen?
Prime Minister Netanyahu, who is on the screen, or was until a moment ago, was Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, as was former President George W. Bush. This is a very good training ground for national leaders, and whoever had the chance to go to a General Assembly any fall in Manhattan knows that this is an essential global forum when you have many clandestine contacts in addition to what goes on in the halls.
Dr. Modric Evan-Khan?
Well, I have a more I think disappointed.
Very shortly.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that the problem is that the P5 have a veto in changing the UN Charter, and so the P5 would not like to lose their veto power, and this is why I think that maybe perhaps in the future the UN will be dismantled.
Dr. Boms?
You can't convince a dictator to lose its power, and therefore I don't anticipate changes anytime soon.
Thank you very much. This is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank also our viewers, and we will see you next time. TV7 Israel's mission is to give you, our viewers, truthful information, which in effect will give you a chance to really understand what is happening in Israel and its region. If you're blessed by our programs and believe our mission to be important, we urge you to support us and become a voice for Israel. You can support us by going to our website at tv7israelnews.com. This program was made possible through your donations.